Now, as a fighter, Steve McQueen, now he is good in that department because that son of a gun.
Steve McQueen left a legacy that went far beyond the silver screen. The king of cool wasn't just a man who raced motorcycles and stole scenes with silent stares. He was a man who built a secret empire that the world barely knew existed. Hidden. Behind the glamour of Hollywood premieres and roaring engines, McQueen amassed wealth that remained invisible, quietly stacking up in barns, vaults, and private accounts, untouched for decades. Few knew the full extent of his fortune. Fewer still understood the cleverness behind his strategy. Even in death, the story didn't end. A shocking discovery decades later turned myth into millions. One family member, once entirely cut out of McQueen's estate, suddenly found themselves connected to a legacy of unimaginable value. What had once seemed like a simple tale of a Hollywood icon became a narrative of secrecy, wealth, and meticulous planning. Every rumor about lost treasures, hidden motorcycles, rare watches, and private collections began to take shape, transforming legend into tangible fortune. But McQueen's story is never straightforward. The deeper investigators and estate managers dug, the more convoluted and intriguing the narrative became. Legal documents hinted at secret partnerships. Forgotten letters and contracts suggested investments most people never suspected. Every new revelation only deepened the mystery. The cool, untouchable star the world admired was also a shrewd businessman, quietly building an empire of rarity, exclusivity, and long-term value. By the time the world fully glimpsed the scope of his holdings, it became clear that Steve McQueen had mastered a dual identity. On the surface, a rebellious actor who broke Hollywood's rules. Beneath, a silent mogul who understood that true power doesn't need to be loud. It simply accumulates, quietly, patiently, invisibly. This is the story of the man who turned chaos into control, coolness into currency, and a Hollywood legend into a fortune that continues to grow long after his final credits rolled. Steve McQueen's journey to Hollywood royalty did not begin on a red carpet or in a film studio. It began in chaos. Born into a life where stability was a foreign concept, McQueen faced abandonment and hardship from the very start. His father walked out before he could even speak, leaving a vacuum of guidance and love. His stepfather was violent, creating an environment of fear and tension, while his mother left him behind more than once, unable or unwilling to provide the care he needed. From the outset, McQueen's world was fractured, a series of broken relationships and missed chances that shaped a young boy into someone who would never rely on anyone but himself. By the age of 14, McQueen found himself in Boys Republic, a reform school in Chino, California. For most kids, school was a place to learn math, history, and literature. But for McQueen, survival became the curriculum. At Boys Republic, every day was a test of strength, wit, and resilience. The hierarchy of teenagers in the institution was brutal. Trust was a currency almost no one could afford. McQueen learned quickly that to endure, he had to fight back, adapt, and protect himself above all else. It was here, amid the walls of discipline and the tension of constant challenge, that the seeds of his later persona were planted. The rebellious, fearless man the world would come to admire was forged in the crucible of hardship. This rough upbringing didn't break him. It hardened him. Where others might have crumbled under the weight of neglect and abuse, McQueen built armor around his personality. His defiance became his shield, and eventually, it became his signature. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he never sought approval or tried to fit in. He didn't follow rules for the sake of acceptance. He made his own rules, and in doing so, he stood out. Producers often despised the drama he brought to sets, but they couldn't ignore the results. McQueen had a presence that demanded attention, a charisma that drew audiences regardless of his temperament. His very refusal to conform became an asset, a magnet for the Hollywood machine. Before stepping into the spotlight, McQueen also joined the Marines, further shaping the man he would become. The rigid structure of military life clashed with his naturally rebellious nature, and clashes with authority were inevitable. He spent time in the brig more than once, but each confrontation added to his resilience, sharpened his edge, and gave him a first-hand understanding of risk, discipline, and consequence. The experience would later inform the authenticity of his performances, lending credibility to his character's courage and determination. He didn't need to act fearless. He had lived through enough real danger to make it believable on screen. By the time he arrived in Hollywood, McQueen was already a man who understood himself and the world around him. He carried the confidence of someone who had survived chaos and emerged unbroken, someone who could stand firm against pressure, confrontation, and expectation. This background would become the foundation for the persona that audiences fell in love with: cool, untouchable, and magnetic. Every glance, every silence, every smirk on screen was the echo of a boy who had learned to protect himself in a world that offered little safety. His early life, though filled with hardship, set the stage for a career built on audacity and instinct. McQueen's childhood taught him not only to endure, but to exploit the world's unpredictability, to turn adversity into a weapon. It gave him a sense of independence and self-reliance that would become central to his Hollywood legend. The man who walked into reform school as a boy, abandoned and overlooked, would later walk onto film sets as a figure larger than life, a symbol of defiance, power, and the magnetic allure of someone who had learned the art of surviving and thriving on his own terms. Steve McQueen's path from reform school to Hollywood stardom was far from conventional. After surviving a childhood of chaos and a turbulent adolescence, he sought structure and discipline in the Marines. It was a natural fit for a young man craving direction, yet it wasn't long before his rebellious spirit clashed with military authority. McQueen was not content to follow orders blindly, and repeated confrontations landed him in the brig more than once. Yet, instead of breaking him, the military experience honed his resilience and sharpened his instincts, giving him a sense of danger and edge that would later define his screen presence. He emerged from service not just as a young man with discipline, but as someone who understood tension, risk, and control, qualities that would become essential in his acting. When McQueen arrived in Hollywood, he was not the typical aspiring star. He didn't chase roles chased him. Punctuality, scripts, and conventional professionalism were often optional in his world. He would walk onto sets late, ignore rehearsals, and occasionally abandon scenes mid-shoot. Directors and producers saw chaos, but audiences saw authenticity. McQueen had a magnetic presence, the kind of screen charisma that made imperfections irrelevant. People were drawn not just to his looks or his stunts, but to the aura of someone who seemed untouchable, fearless and entirely his own. His breakthrough came with The Great Escape, a film that would cement his legend. McQueen's performance was largely silent, yet every glance and gesture conveyed depth and determination far beyond the script. Audiences remember him not for dialogue, but for presence, the quiet confidence of a man who had lived and fought, and who carried that experience effortlessly into his art. The motorcycle jump, now iconic, became a symbol of McQueen's daring persona, even if a stuntman executed the leap. It wasn't the stunt itself, but the mythology it created, a silent, untouchable figure who seemed capable of anything. Then came Bullet, the film that would forever redefine action cinema. McQueen performed his own driving stunts through the streets of San Francisco, creating a car chase that remains legendary. The green Mustang fastback he drove wasn't just a car, it became a symbol of cool, speed, and rebellion. Decades later, that very Mustang sold for $37 million, a testament not just to its cinematic significance, but to McQueen's enduring influence on culture and collectors alike. His choices on set, his insistence on authenticity, and his willingness to push boundaries transformed Hollywood's understanding of stardom. Yet McQueen's life off-screen was just as compelling as his roles. He eschewed the Hollywood party scene, avoiding red carpets, premieres, and press events when possible. Jeans replaced tuxedos, silence replaced speeches. This avoidance of spectacle only enhanced his mystique. Studios knew he was difficult, but audiences didn't care. His magnetism and reputation for authenticity made every film an event, a glimpse of someone who refused to be tamed or molded by conventional expectations. McQueen's rebellious streak extended to his professional dealings as well. He demanded unprecedented control over his projects, negotiating high upfront salaries and back-end deals that ensured he benefited from the success of his films. His strategy in The Thomas Crown Affair and The Towering Inferno reshaped Hollywood's understanding of actor power, establishing a precedent for financial and creative leverage that few dared to claim at the time. McQueen wasn't just a star. He was a force of influence, reshaping the rules of the very industry he dominated. By combining his raw life experience, military discipline, and fearless approach to cinema, Steve McQueen became the embodiment of the maverick star. He wasn't acting. He was simply being himself, and that authenticity resonated with audiences worldwide. His blend of danger, charm, and defiance created a persona that transcended film. A living legend whose image, stunts, and attitude would echo across generations. McQueen's rise to fame was not just about talent. It was about survival, instinct, and the ability to turn a lifetime of chaos into a legend that Hollywood and the world could never ignore. By the late 1960s, Steve McQueen had established himself as a force to be reckoned with in Hollywood. But unlike most stars of his era, he didn't merely rely on his talent or charisma. He rewrote the rules of the industry itself. McQueen understood that true power wasn't just about appearing on screen. It was about controlling every aspect of the image, the process, and ultimately, the money. He became a master of negotiation, using his rising fame to carve out a level of autonomy few actors had ever experienced. In The Thomas Crown Affair, 1968, McQueen demanded a staggering $750,000 up front, a sum nearly unheard of at the time. He wasn't just chasing wealth. He was staking his claim in a world that had historically dictated the terms of actors' careers. Then came The Towering Inferno, where he negotiated a back-end deal that granted him a share of the film's profits. That deal alone earned him over $12 million, solidifying his reputation not just as a box office draw, but as a financial strategist who could leverage fame into enduring wealth. McQueen's approach to his craft went beyond paychecks. He demanded control over wardrobe, camera angles, and character portrayal. Studios initially balked, viewing him as difficult, temperamental, even rebellious. But they quickly realized that acquiescing to his terms was profitable. Audiences didn't care about his eccentricities. They cared about the raw energy, authenticity, and edge he brought to every frame. The paradox was clear. The more he defied the studio system, the more valuable he became. He also monetized aspects of his career that other actors overlooked. McQueen charged $50,000 simply to read a script, whether or not he accepted the role. This audacious tactic ensured that even rejection generated income. He had learned early in life that control and foresight were far more powerful than conformity. In doing so, he blurred the line between art and business, transforming his very presence into a revenue-generating machine. McQueen's negotiating brilliance extended into partnerships and endorsements as well. He recognized the potential of branding long before it became an industry standard. His association with Honda in the U.S., for example, was more than a promotional deal. It was a strategic stake in a market that would continue generating profits for years. His desert racing lifestyle wasn't merely a hobby. It was a marketing platform, promoting motorcycles and gear in which he held financial interest. McQueen's silence, his careful avoidance of overt publicity, became a tool. The less he spoke, the more mystique and demand he generated. By the time he was at the peak of his career, McQueen had mastered the delicate balance between rebellion and authority. He knew when to push, when to step back, and when to let his reputation do the work for him. Studios paid him handsomely not just because of ticket sales, but because his very presence demanded attention and respect. In redefining the rules, he transformed the actor from a mere employee of the studio to a co-architect of both creative vision and financial success. Steve McQueen's career demonstrated that power in Hollywood wasn't just about talent or fame. It was about strategy, leverage, and foresight. He turned defiance into currency, independence into authority, and his enigmatic persona into a lasting brand. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, his methods continued to influence the industry, leaving a blueprint for actors who sought not just to perform, but to dominate both creatively and financially. In every deal, every negotiation, and every calculated choice, McQueen proved that the king of cool was also the king of control. Steve McQueen's public persona, the cool, untouchable Hollywood star, was only one side of the story. Beneath the surface of movie sets, high-speed chases, and red carpet events, McQueen was quietly constructing an empire, a private world of wealth and assets that few knew existed. Unlike the flashy stars of his era, he didn't need to showcase his fortune in mansions, jewelry, or extravagant parties. Instead, he accumulated value silently, strategically, turning his passions into investments and his reputation into currency. McQueen's fascination with machines went far beyond the thrill of speed. Cars and motorcycles were more than hobbies, they were assets. Over the years, he amassed one of the largest private motorcycle collections in history, numbering over 130 rare and vintage bikes. British Triumphs, German Husqvarnas, American Indians. Each bike had been carefully chosen, often customized, and many were one-of-a-kind models collectors would later pay fortunes for. But McQueen didn't flaunt his collection. It was stored in temperature-controlled garages on remote properties, hidden from the public eye, waiting for the right moment to reveal its value. His love of cars was equally meticulous. Nearly 60 high-end historic vehicles filled his private vaults. Among them were a 1963 Ferrari 250 GT Lusso, a Jaguar XKSS, and the very Mustang GT390 from Bullitt. The collection also included a rare Porsche 917K, one of the most iconic racing cars ever built, a car that later sold at auction for over $14 million. McQueen wasn't simply collecting for the thrill of ownership, he was investing in items with enduring historical and cultural significance. Every car, every motorcycle had a story, racing victories, cinematic fame, or rare craftsmanship that guaranteed it would appreciate over time. Beyond vehicles, McQueen understood the value of branding and licensing. His partnership with Honda in the U.S. was a masterstroke. By lending his image to promote motorcycles, he not only elevated the brand but also earned stakes in their marketing campaigns, creating streams of passive income that continued long after he stopped riding on camera. Similarly, his desert racing pursuits were not just recreational, they were strategic. McQueen promoted the gear, vehicles, and accessories he had financial interests in, turning appearances and victories into profit without a word of public's endorsement. His silence was, in fact, his most effective marketing tool. Real estate was another pillar of his empire. McQueen quietly acquired properties in California, Mexico, and Idaho, choosing locations for privacy and investment potential, rather than glamour. Unlike many of his contemporaries who lived to be seen, McQueen lived to secure value. He diversified his holdings further with rare collectibles, vintage watches, and art, curating a private portfolio that combined cultural significance with financial prudence. Even his film work became part of the empire. McQueen negotiated profit-sharing arrangements in several movie contracts, ensuring that residual income would continue for years, regardless of the film's continued popularity. Licensing deals, both for his image and for merchandise related to his films, were structured to provide ongoing revenue streams. In essence, he created a self-sustaining system where every choice, on-screen, off-screen, on a racetrack, or in a barn, contributed to long-term wealth. What made McQueen's empire extraordinary was the foresight behind it. He lived modestly, in public, avoiding ostentation and the trappings of fame, yet his private holdings told a very different story. His estate planners later described it as one of the most carefully constructed private fortunes of its era. Accounts, properties, cars, motorcycles, watches, and licensing agreements were meticulously tracked and strategically managed, ensuring that his wealth would survive legal complications, medical expenses, and the passage of time. By the time of his passing in 1980, most people assumed McQueen had died with little to show for his career. Cancer treatments, lawsuits, and medical expenses painted a picture of financial struggle. In reality, he had scattered his wealth across hidden accounts, real estate, and intellectual property, shielded from public view. It was a deliberate strategy. What appeared as modesty or financial strain was actually a cloak, concealing a sophisticated and valuable estate. McQueen's secret empire didn't stop at tangible assets. He had partial ownership in racing teams, film licensing companies, and small businesses tied to his passions. Even the desert racing company he promoted had agreements that sent royalties directly to his estate. Each venture, each investment was carefully selected not just for immediate return but for its long-term potential. McQueen was building a legacy, not just a lifestyle. The genius of McQueen's strategy lay in its quiet execution. While peers spent lavishly and often recklessly, he preserved his wealth in ways that would outlast fleeting fame. His motorcycles, cars, watches, and properties were more than collectibles. They were a portfolio, a tangible representation of foresight, patience, and understanding of value. By the time estate managers began cataloging his holdings years later, it became clear that Steve McQueen had built a fortune that was as legendary as his on-screen performances. In the end, the King of Cool had achieved something far greater than cinematic immortality. He had created a private empire meticulously designed to endure. While the public celebrated his stunts, his films, and his defiance of Hollywood norms, McQueen's most enduring triumph was the wealth and legacy he quietly amassed, hidden from view, yet monumental in scope. What the world saw was the actor, the rebel, the icon. What few realized was that beneath it all lay a strategist, a collector, and a silent mogul whose empire would continue to grow long after his final credits rolled. When Steve McQueen passed away in 1980, the world mourned the loss of a cinematic icon. To the public, it seemed as though the King of Cool had left little behind. Stories circulated of mounting medical bills from his battle with cancer, legal disputes over contracts, and the general expenses that come with a life in Hollywood. To many, it appeared that the man who had conquered screens and hearts worldwide had died financially depleted, his legendary fortune a myth rather than reality. But those who knew the inner workings of McQueen's life understood that appearances were deceptive. The truth was far more complex, far more calculated. McQueen had spent decades quietly building an empire, diversifying his wealth across multiple forms of assets and investments. Real estate holdings in California, Mexico, and Idaho, hidden. Bank accounts, rare collectibles, luxury cars, and motorcycles were all carefully documented yet discreetly protected. Even in death, his strategy of privacy and discretion ensured that the full extent of his fortune remained hidden from public view. Estate managers who eventually began to piece together his holdings were astonished at the foresight and precision of his planning. McQueen had structured his affairs to endure, ensuring that taxes, debts, and legal complications would have minimal impact on the longevity of his wealth. Intellectual property, film residuals, licensing deals, and profit-sharing agreements continued to generate income, turning what many assumed was a modest estate into a thriving financial entity. Even decades later, the value of McQueen's estate continued to grow. Cars and motorcycles once tucked away in private garages became auction legends, fetching sums that defied imagination. Licensing deals for his image, name, and likeness ensured steady streams of revenue, reminding the world that McQueen's influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Where many celebrities fade into obscurity, McQueen's presence remained potent, both on screen and in financial terms. What made this even more remarkable was the contrast between perception and reality. While the public believed he had lived, modestly and perhaps even struggled at the end, even now, years after these discoveries, McQueen's hidden treasures continue to impact the world. Auctions, exhibitions, and licensing deals bring his estate millions of dollars annually. Cars, motorcycles, and collectibles that were once quietly stored in barns now fetch record-breaking sums, and his name remains a powerful brand in both the automotive and cinematic worlds. Steve McQueen's legacy, it turns out, was never just about the films he made or the stunts he performed. It was about creating a life and an empire that would endure, quietly, strategically, and magnificently, long after the cameras stopped rolling. The barn in New Mexico became more than a storage space. It was a revelation, a turning point in understanding the King of Cool. For decades, McQueen had orchestrated his life so that fame, passion, and wealth converged into one seamless, enduring story. And with each motorcycle unearthed, each rare car auctioned, and each piece of memorabilia revealed, the world realized the truth. Steve McQueen was not just an actor, not just a legend. He was a silent mogul, a collector, a strategist, and a man whose foresight and planning created a treasure trove the world had almost forgotten, but never truly could. Steve McQueen's story is more than a tale of stardom. It is a masterclass in foresight, strategy, and enduring influence. The CEI. King of Cool became an icon not merely for his films, stunts, or magnetic presence, but for the quiet empire he built behind the scenes. Cars, motorcycles, watches, film rights, and strategic business ventures combined into a fortune that continues to grow decades after his passing. His legacy is dual. The public remembers the rebel, the actor, the fearless driver who defined cool. Yet behind closed doors, McQueen was a strategist and collector, quietly shaping an empire with precision and care. Every investment, every partnership, and every collection reflected his understanding of value, rarity, and long-term impact. Even now, McQueen's influence resonates on the silver screen, in auctions fetching record-breaking sums, and in the mythology of Hollywood itself. He proved that true power lies not in spectacle, but in patience, intelligence, and vision. The man who survived chaos, mastered Hollywood, and built an unseen fortune remains timeless. Steve McQueen was more than a star. He was a legend, a silent mogul, and the embodiment of cool that endures quietly and magnificently across generations.